Hi everyone, a big welcome back to my channel. How are you all doing? I hope you're all doing really well. Did you enjoy spooky season? Are you enjoying November so far? I am absolutely loving the whole thing. It is like my absolute favorite time of the year. I am feeling very content. My reading has also been super good recently. I tend to get really into mood reading and seasonal reading at this time of the year. Let me know if you're the same. So today we're going to be talking about all of the books that I read in October, and my October reading was delicious. I read poetry and fantasy and historical fiction and classics and spooky books. Let's get into the reviews, shall we? The first book that I picked up in October was Stung with Love, Poems and Fragments by Sappho. Starting off with an absolute stunner. This is a collection of the surviving texts from Sappho from around 150 years after Homer's Iliad. This is very lyrical poetry exploring themes of desire and remembrance and spite. So this was a bit of a random read for me. We have had this book on our shelves for quite a while now, more so for Cameron, my husband. He loves reading ancient literature, specifically Greek literature, but I suddenly just had this urge to widen my poetry reading horizons a bit. If you know my channel at all, you'll probably know that I love reading contemporary poetry. I saw this on our shelves, it called out to me, and I decided to give it a go. And boy, am I so glad that I did, because I loved this. Obviously, this whole thing feels quite fragmented, so we're getting pieces of writing from different places and different times. The collection is helpfully split into sections, so the poems are grouped together by theme, which was brilliant. We also have the poems on the right-hand pages, and then on the left-hand pages we have some kind of contextual information and a kind of explanation of what's going on in the poem. All of this was so helpful and really interesting. It really allowed me to get the most out of this reading experience. And the poems in here are so stunning. I don't know why I felt like I wasn't going to get as much out of them as contemporary poems, but a lot of them really did hit me in the same way. These poems are gorgeous and vivid and scathing and sultry. The imagery is so beautiful, and reading the poetry aloud really feels like the right way to read this collection. I totally loved this. I will for sure be diving back into some ancient poetry soon. Big recommend to anybody who likes any kind of poetry. Obviously, I gave it 5 stars. Next up, I read The Burning God by R.F. Kuang. This is the final installment in the Poppy War series, a historical military fantasy series inspired by 20th century China. This series broadly follows the story of a young woman named Rin who, despite all the odds, manages to attend the most elite military training school in the empire. Here, Rin discovers her unearthly, lethal power for shamanism, and all the while, the peace of the Nikan Empire is growing more and more unstable. So if you want to hear my thoughts on the first and second installments in this trilogy, you can go and hear them in my previous recent reads videos. In short, I liked the books, but I definitely had problems with them. Not amazing, definitely not the best fantasy I have ever read, but kind of fun and very political and military focused, which I found to be very fresh and enjoyable. Obviously, this is the third and final installment in the series, so I won't talk about the plot too much, but this book did kind of do what I hoped it would. It definitely stayed in line with the other books in the series, but kind of stepped up a little bit for the finale, you know, widening in scope and peril in all the ways that you would want it to. It still certainly had the same problems as the earlier books, most prominently lacking in character development and connection to the characters. But that's old news at this point. Overall, I am pleased that I read this series. I did enjoy the reading experience on the whole, and I do think that this was the strongest installment in the series. I would recommend this series if it is your kind of vibe, but it definitely wasn't my absolute favourite, which puts me in the minority. So in the end, I gave this one 3.5 stars. Next up, we have House of Hollow by Crystal Sutherland. This is a YA horror novel that I picked up for spooky season. For some reason, this Halloween, I was super in the mood for darker, moodier, more psychological reads. This one follows the story of 17-year-old Iris and her two older sisters. Something weird happened to them when they were younger. They all bear the same half-moon scar at the base of their throats. Then Iris's eldest sister goes missing. Many strange things start to happen, and Iris has to figure out what happened to them as kids and what is going on now. So I kind of have mixed feelings about this one. In many ways, it was exactly what I wanted it to be. The vibes in here were sublime, super spooky and like glamorous but dark. And I do have to say that the writing in here was occasionally very good. There were some moments of beautiful description, super visceral and creepy. That being said, I don't think this book was great in every way. The characters were okay. I was intrigued by them all, but I did find them to be a bit stereotypy and a bit one note. Also, the ending did somewhat let me down. It felt a little weak to me. I wanted something a bit more exciting, and this was a real shame because the ride to get to the end was filled with so much promise. So yeah, overall I would say this was okay. It definitely did the job. It had me turning the pages. If this is your kind of thing, then I do recommend giving it a go. In the end, I gave it 3 stars. Next up, in October, I picked up Lily, A Tale of Revenge by Rose Tremaine. This is a new novel coming out on the 11th of November. It was one of my most anticipated releases of the year. I was kindly sent this proof copy by the publisher. Set in Victorian London, it tells the story of a young woman named Lily who was saved by a police officer when she was a baby. As a child, she is sent to a hospital to be punished for her rebellious spirit, and then later on, when she is released into the harsh world of Victorian London, the police officer is still watching over her, but Lily harbours a terrible secret. So you may or may not know that I absolutely love Rose Tremaine. She is just one of those super acclaimed and really experienced authors. You are in safe hands when you're reading one of her books. This one particularly excited me. Every now and again, I get super in the mood for a dark Victorian novel, especially when they focus on a morally grey female character. This is the perfect time of year to read such a novel. And I did really enjoy this. I loved the world that was built up and all of the various settings. I loved moving from the hospital with Lily when she was young to the wig emporium that she works at as a young woman, to the family farm that she lives in for a while as a child with a foster family. I loved these different locations and the descriptions and all of the different sights and smells evoked. I do have to say that this was slightly less plot driven than I thought it was going to be. There is this piecing together of Lily's story and this kind of intrigue surrounding what she has done, but there isn't a quick pace to this novel at all, and I never really felt a real sense of peril. I do think this works in the book, but it is worth knowing before going in. Lily I found to be really interesting as a character. I loved getting to know her. I actually would have loved to have got to know her even more, I think. It sometimes felt as though we were seeing what happened to Lily rather than experiencing it with her, if that makes sense. But overall, I really did enjoy this. I think I just have super high expectations because it's Rose Tremaine. But a really great read, a really atmospheric read. So in the end, I gave it 4 stars. Next up, I read Sin is Due to Open in a Room Above Kitty's by Morag Anderson. This is a contemporary poetry collection by Fly on the Wall Press. They kindly sent me this copy. It explores themes of love and relationships and violence and the damage that we can do to one another. I really enjoyed this collection. It's actually more of a chapbook, really. It's very, very short, so really easy to fly through. I really loved the themes in here. They're super, super interesting. There's definitely a kind of dichotomy throughout, where on one hand you're exploring themes of abuse and cruelty and constraint, but then dappled throughout there are also these moments of real light and joy and openness. These poems are very lyrical, which is something I really enjoyed. There's a lot of imagery in here, a lot of body imagery and natural imagery and stuff alluding to mortality. This collection didn't blow me away in the end. I didn't feel too connected to it personally. The poems didn't really manage to touch me, but I did really enjoy a lot of what was going on in here. I do think Morag Anderson is a really good poet, and honestly, if it's good enough for John McCullough, as blurbed on the back here, then I'm sure the majority of this was just me not really understanding what was going on. So in the end, I gave this one 3 stars. Next up, in October, I read Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a Victorian novel and my pick for Victober, which, if you don't know, is just where people read all things Victorian literature on BookTube in October. Set in an English country town, this one primarily tells the story of 2 middle-aged spinster sisters who are living in reduced circumstances. It explores themes of rural community life and female friendships, with dashes of tragedy and death thrown in there as well. So I love Elizabeth Gaskell. I absolutely fell in love with her when I read North and South last year. I now want to read all of her books. This one did feel very different to North and South. First and foremost, it is a lot shorter. It is also structured through a series of little vignettes rather than it being a more traditional linear connected story. But at the same time, this did also manage to feel distinctly Elizabeth Gaskell, what with the rural setting and the social and political discourse and the fun cast of characters. It did have everything that I love about Elizabeth Gaskell. And the thing that surprised me the most about this book was just how funny it was. This book is kind of sassy and kind of dry right from the start. Its take on the characters and their ways of life and their views just had me smiling. In the end, I didn't love this one as much as North and South. While I did enjoy the structuring, I don't think it allowed me to get as connected to the characters. But a great read, great insight, a really fun reading experience, just not my absolute favourite. So in the end, I gave this one 4 stars. Next up, in October, I read The Push by Ashley Audrain. This was another darker, more psychological read that I picked up in honour of Halloween. This is described as a psychological literary novel that tells the story of a new mother who becomes convinced that something is wrong with her baby. It explores themes of sanity and insanity, fear and believability. So I'd seen this book doing the rounds recently. Everybody seemed to be reading it and really enjoying it, and this premise had me hooked immediately. I love themes of motherhood, and pair this with a super unreliable narrator, and I was there. So lush. I did really enjoy reading this book, and I read it super quickly. Questioning what was real and what wasn't real throughout the book was such a ride. It really had me sitting on the edge of my seat. Important to point out that this book is definitely dark. The evil child thing is kind of terrifying, but I just loved how this was woven in with more everyday motherhood fears. I loved the blurring of the lines. I have to say, I haven't 100% made up my mind on how I feel about the ending, the kind of reveal, if you will. I think I like it. It's definitely really punchy, which is something that I enjoyed. But regardless, a really good read. If you like this kind of thing, then I think you will tear through this. And in the end, I gave it 4 stars. Next up, I read Wide Acre by Philippa Gregory. So I listened to this book on audio basically solely for the reason that it was included in my membership. And I really do like reading historical fiction at this time of the year, so I thought, why not? And let me tell you, I have come away from this reading experience with so many mixed feelings. Let's start off by saying that this book was kind of shit. There were many things that I didn't like about it. First and foremost, I was not prepared for where this book went. I will not go into details, but incest is a very prominent theme in this book right from the start. But on top of that, the protagonist in this book was just a terrible person. She was vile. She made such terrible decisions all the way through, and she just never let up. It felt to me as though the author was trying to explore themes of social nonconformity and feminism, but just did it in a really fucked up way. I also think the pacing was kind of off in here. The book was too long and it often felt quite self-indulgent on the part of the author. But that all being said, I could not stop reading this book. It was so addictive, and even while I didn't particularly like what was going on, I still felt totally compelled to find out what would happen. It cannot be denied that this book is a ride. Tons of twists and turns, tons of scandal and shocks. And I do have to say that I do really like Philippa Gregory's writing style. Her prose is very lovely. It's so easy to read and just carries you along, filled with super beautiful descriptions of nature and all the different places in here. So yeah, this was really weird in so many ways. I deeply disliked it, but I also totally devoured it. So I think I'm just going to give this one a 2.5 stars and call it a day. The penultimate book that I read in October was These Mothers of Gods by Rachel Bauer. This is another contemporary poetry collection, this one also by Fly on the Wall Press. This collection seeks to recover the lost experiences from women throughout history, and it espouses a more expansive concept of motherhood, exploring our responsibility towards our lives and our environments and the natural world. So I loved this collection, let me tell you. The strong, clear theme of motherhood that ran throughout these poems was just divine. These poems felt determined and strong and really celebratory. They really hark back to the people and places that shape us. I also really loved the imagery throughout this collection. It is definitely very bizarre. There is a lot of colourful and visceral imagery throughout, a lot of natural imagery. This whole thing just felt very evocative to me. I have to admit that I don't think I necessarily understood everything that was going on in here. Some of the poems definitely went over my head. But in a way, I didn't really mind because I loved the words and I loved the piecing together of strange things and the imagery that was created. I kind of don't really know how this collection was empowering to me, but it definitely felt empowering. Worst poetry review ever. I am so sorry, fucking clear as mud. Just know that I love this, and in the end I gave it 4.5 stars. And the final book that I read in October was Lemon by Kwon Yo-sun. This is a translated novel, translated from Korean by Janet Kong. It tells the story of the murder of a 19-year-old woman in the summer of 2002 that later became known as the high school beauty murder. 17 years later, the case long gone cold, Daeon, the younger sister of the murdered woman, sets out to find the truth of what happened. So unfortunately, we're ending on a bit of a sad note because this book didn't really work for me. I really hoped that I was going to love this. I was so in the mood for some Korean lit. I really liked that it was short. I was hoping it was going to be super punchy and insightful. But ultimately, I just didn't really get much from this reading experience at all. I liked aspects of the book. I liked the structuring. We get to learn about a few different people who are connected to the case in one way or another, so it kind of reads like a detective novel. But while this was the case, I really liked that this wasn't the central focus of the book. I think the book was more so trying to explore themes of grief and trauma and retribution, rather than it just being a straight up whodunit book. And this wasn't necessarily bad. The writing was definitely really nice in places, but ultimately I just didn't really connect with it. I didn't really gain much insight from it. I kind of came away from it not really understanding the point. So a big shame, but in the end I gave this one 2.5 stars. So there we have it. Those were all of the books that I read this October. Thank you so much for hearing me chat about them. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you heard of something that sparked your interest. As always, please let me know what you've been reading recently. I would love to hear. Chat to me down below in the comments. Thanks again, everyone. I hope you're doing well, and I look forward to seeing you in my next one. Bye.